Good afternoon, this is Mrs. Ward and this is a lesson on Romeo and Juliet. I'm going to focus on Capulet today, but before I do, a quick recap of the genre. So the play is a tragedy and you have a little quotation up at the top which is from Aristotle in the Poetics. So tragedy originated from ancient Greece and it was generally used to make a criticism of society. So as we explore the character of Capulet, I want you to think about what is it that Shakespeare was criticising about society through Capulet. What do we learn from him and his behaviour and his actions? Now, the quotation you can see on the screen in red says that tragedies are an imitation not of men, but of life and action, of happiness and misery. So they kind of reflect real life scenarios, and usually, there is something we can learn from it. Now, the original grudge in the play stems back to Capulet and Montague. This ancient grudge, we never really find out what that grudge is. It seems like it's so old and long forgotten that even they don't really know what they're fighting for anymore. And again, that adds to the tragic nature of the play. All of these characters die, and what are they dying for? They sort of seem to die for no real reason. So one of the things straight away that we can say Shakespeare is criticising is violence and holding a grudge. Now, you've got some terms on your screen. These are terms related to the genre of tragedy, and you can pause the video at this point and you can do a little bit of research on those terms, but if not, we'll come back to those at a later date. But the play culminates in a Pyrrhic victory. Now, a Pyrrhic victory is a victory in the sense that at the end of the play, the two families, the Montagues and the Capulets, they bury the hatchet and they make peace. But the prince refers to it as a glooming peace upon Verona, because there's been so much death to lead to it. So a Pyrrhic victory is a victory, but where there is huge sacrifice on both sides. So again, we can think about what can be learned from this, all of this violence, all of this feuding, and ultimately, the people it hurts the most are the Capulets and the Montagues, because they both lose their children as a consequence of their own violent, toxic behaviour. So again, linking to this idea that Shakespeare is criticising aspects of society. So we're going to focus on Capulet today, and you've got 3 questions to consider. How is Capulet presented here? What do we learn about society? So attitudes to women and marriage. Now, this is an Elizabethan play, so we need to think about what was going on in the Elizabethan era, what was going on culturally, politically, and what we can learn about society through this play. And why do you think Capulet changes so drastically in Act 3? So let's have a look at how he's presented at the start of the play in Act 1, Scene 2. The first thing that he says is, "'Tis not so hard for men as old as us to keep the peace," which straight away introduces the idea that he's quite sensible and quite calm almost in that observation. For men as old and as mature as us, we should be able to keep the peace. Now, he says this to Paris, and yet this comes after the violence of the brawl at the very, very start, where he's also, wanting to be violent. He says, "Fetch me my long sword." So he's instantly prone to violence himself. So we've got this little bit of almost irrational behaviour in him. He goes from violence to saying that he should be able to keep the peace. Now, why do we think, why does he make this claim to Paris calmly, but doesn't perhaps reinforce it publicly? And I guess we could link that to the fact that this is a patriarchal society. So patriarchy, which you should have researched already, means that it's a society which is dominated and ruled by men. And therefore, perhaps Capulet doesn't openly show that he wants to keep the peace, because it might be seen as weakness, and it might be seen as some kind of lack of masculinity perhaps on his part. So although he thinks that they should keep the peace, he doesn't openly profess it. And that could be seen to add to the tragedy of the play, because if these men could kind of put their bravado aside, perhaps so many people wouldn't have died. So we could see that perhaps as a little bit of a criticism of the way that men in this era behaved and their desire to be seen as violent and macho. When he's talking to Paris, so Paris is the suitor that he's picked for Juliet to marry. Now, it says in the question, what do we learn about society? Well, we already know, because it's a patriarchal society, that women were second-class citizens, and really they were treated as possessions. And And marriage, obviously by modern standards, really people marry for love. But in the Elizabethan era, marriages were often arranged based on status and class. So Juliet would be married to somebody who was seen as a suitable, well-respected suitor, and it was all about creating this sense of position in society and status. So Paris has been selected as the groom for Juliet, but look at how Capulet speaks. He says, using this metaphor, "My child is yet a stranger in the world." So it suggests that he knows his daughter quite well. You know, the idea that she's a stranger in the world suggests that she's innocent and naive. He tells Paris, "Let 2 more summers wither in their pride, ere we may think her ripe to be a bride." So we have this rhyming, this rhyming line that emphasises that actually he doesn't want Juliet to get married right now. He wants her to wait, he wants her to grow and mature. Shakespeare uses this natural imagery, which again suggests that Capulet is nurturing Juliet. He wants her to grow, he wants her to mature and be ripe to be a bride. So the imagery is quite positive and shows a really caring nature in Capulet's character, which might have been quite surprising for the Elizabethans because the father ruled the roost and was the patriarch. And actually what we're seeing is this almost sensitive side to his character where he's thinking about Juliet's feelings and not just what he can gain. He goes on to tell her, "Woo her, gentle Paris," again suggesting that he wants Juliet to be in love and that for this marriage not just to be a kind of a social match that would benefit the family. He actually wants Juliet to be happy in her match. Then goes on to say she's the hopeful lady of my earth, suggesting that he sees all of his hopes and all of his future wishes and desires are kind of in Juliet, and therefore this marriage is really important to him, that he gets it right. So how is Capulet presented here? He's actually presented as a caring father figure, somebody who is choosing his daughter's husband, but choosing responsibly and putting her feelings at the forefront of that decision. Now, in response, Paris says, "Younger than she a happy mother's maid." Now, this usually kind of disturbs and shocks students because Juliet is only 13, and to know that girls younger than Juliet are already married and already mothers is quite shocking. But obviously, by Elizabethan standards, this was the norm. Okay, this was the social, cultural norm of the time. People didn't live into their 70s and 80s. You know, people lived and died quite young. So people were married very early into their teens. So we're seeing Capulet being quite almost radical in the fact that he isn't instantly forcing this marriage forward. Now, what I suggest you do is pause the video here and make some notes on Capulet and how he's presented at the start of the play. So we can see that he's quite rational and thoughtful in the fact that he doesn't want to keep fighting. We can see that he's considerate of his daughter's feelings and that he is actually putting her needs first. So we've just thought about this idea, you know, although Juliet would be seen almost as property of Capulet, in Act 1, Scene 2, he doesn't really treat her as such. We see him wanting the best for his daughter and being a caring father figure. So what changes? You know, why in Act 3 do we suddenly see him acting really brutish, really dominant and really aggressive towards Juliet, even calling her baggage, like she's just a burden that he has to carry? What changes, what events actually happen? So it might be worth now just making a couple of notes on the things that happen between Act 1 and Act 3. There are a couple of main events. Firstly, Capulet has been told by the prince that if there is any more violence, then he will pay the forfeit with his life. So there's a really severe penalty if this feuding keeps happening. Then when Capulet has the ball, Tybalt challenges Capulet at the ball. So when he sees Romeo, Tybalt wants to fight there and then. He thinks it's a shame and he thinks it's a disgrace that Romeo is there. And Capulet is enraged by Tybalt. He doesn't want to create a mutiny amongst his guests. Now, Tybalt is challenging Capulet here. So what are we seeing? We're seeing a young man challenging an older man's patriarchal rule and dominance. And this obviously makes Capulet angry. We then see that he tells Tybalt to let it go. But Tybalt, as we know, he doesn't let it go. In Act 3, Tybalt goes to find Romeo, challenges Romeo, he kills Mercutio and ends up getting killed himself. Again, Think how badly this reflects upon Capulet, that he can't control his own family. So we can see that perhaps Capulet is feeling quite challenged. Now, think about this from Shakespeare's point of view. Is Shakespeare trying to make us feel sorry for Capulet here because he's been disrespected? Is Capulet himself almost a victim of the patriarchy? You know, all of these pressures upon him, and he feels the need to act in a certain way, and he kind of takes that out on Juliet in Act 3. So I'm going to show you a little clip of how Capulet behaves in Act 3.
Never after. Look me in the face. Reply not. Do not. I say. Why? Blessed. The God had lent us but this only child, but now I see this one. That we have a curse in having her. Out on her!
So we see a complete change in Capulet. His language is violent and aggressive. Shakespeare uses quite a lot of derogatory terms, so referring to Juliet as baggage. He threatens to drag her to the church if she refuses to marry Paris. Now again, Capulet here is acting very differently from what we saw in Act 1, but I think what we need to think about is, why is he behaving in this way? He has been disrespected by Tybalt and ignored. He's been challenged by his own nephew. His servants and family members are brawling in the street. And now in Act 3, he's arranged this marriage. Now, why has he arranged this marriage? There's a question on the right-hand side. You know, why does he decide to bring the marriage forward? Are his intentions well-meaning or selfish? Or can you argue both? So I think you could argue that because Juliet is so upset, and he believes she's upset because of the death of Tybalt, he thinks this would be a good thing. It will bring a sudden day of joy for the family, and it will give them something positive to focus on. But you could also argue there is a selfish element here. He wants to reassert himself as the patriarch, and he feels quite challenged at the moment, and that his dominance is being questioned. So he decides to assert himself by bringing this marriage forward. So we see him threatening Juliet. We see him saying that she's no longer a blessing to him. He thought she was a blessing, but now she's like a curse upon this family. So have a think about the stretch and challenge question. Capulet can be seen as a victim of Elizabethan male expectations we can sympathise with, a brutish bully easily drawn to violence, a well-meaning father, a tragic figure who learns a lesson, a complex man. To what extent do you agree? So I do think that Shakespeare is presenting him as a complex man, someone who we can sympathise with. At times, for his daughter to disobey him would have been really shocking. And for the Elizabethan audience, many of them would have thought that Juliet was being disobedient towards her father and would have sympathised with Capulet. And, you know, they would have sympathised with Juliet's plight also. Modern audience, perhaps we feel more sorry for Juliet being forced into a marriage that she doesn't want to be a part of. But it might be worth jotting down some of those phrases. So, you know, is he a brutish bully, easily drawn to violence, a well-meaning father, a tragic figure who learns a lesson, a complex man? So again, you might want to pause the video and make some additional notes on Capulet. Now, your question in green says, can you make links to context to explain and justify Capulet's change? So the words that I would want to be using there would be words like patriarchy, male expectation, and dominance. Okay, he is the head of the household and he is feeling challenged and threatened, and that might help to explain his behaviour. So in the play we see quite a lot of aggressive male behaviour, and on the left hand side of your screen you can see some phrases that we could use when talking about the behaviour of males, including Capulet. The feud spreads like a poison. We see toxic masculinity in this play. Could we argue that men are victims of these expectations? You know, they're expected to be macho, they're expected to be dominant. So do they feel that they need to prove themselves? We see a lot of male bravado and ego from Capulet, Tybalt, Mercutio. We see power struggles between these characters, and we see the use of violence to assert power, which leads to really dire consequences. And we already know that tragedy is a criticism of society. So I think it would be fair to say that Shakespeare is criticising this sort of violent behaviour and these sort of relationships that are so toxic in that society at that time. So the last two things I'm going to show you is the start of a model answer on Capulet. What would you be writing up if you were writing an essay now? So I'm going to show you two slides on Capulet, and then I'm going to show you a few key quotations, which again you can pause and jot down to build up a really good character study for Capulet. So initially Capulet is presented as aggressive when in 1-1 he demands "get me my long sword." But in Act 1, Scene 2, Shakespeare presents him as a figure who can be rational, respectful and caring. Speaking to Paris, he reveals it should not be hard for old men to keep the peace, and he understands his daughter's naivety, shown in the metaphor "my child is yet a stranger in the world." Capulet's desire to let 2 more summers pass before the marriage shows him prioritising Juliet's feelings. In my opinion, this makes the tragedy more upsetting because, and you need to think about what opinion you would add there. And for me, I would probably be saying something along the lines that actually Capulet's intentions are good and he does seem to truly want what is best for Juliet, and yet he's so blinded by the feud and violence and societal expectation that he doesn't see what's happening right under his own nose, and Juliet doesn't have the confidence to tell her father how she truly feels, and that to me adds to the tragedy. Capulet's swift change of heart in Act 3 contributes to Juliet's decision to kill herself. He appears to move from being caring to violent as his fingers itch, and he threatens to drag her to church. In my opinion, he becomes the aggressive patriarch because he feels his power and dominance is being challenged, firstly by Tybalt and now by his own daughter. To some extent, he is a victim of male expectation, as he feels compelled to stamp down on disobedience, which leads to catastrophic events. At the end of the play, he feels the feud has led to the sacrifice of his one and only heir, and Shakespeare could be highlighting the idea that these violent delights have violent ends, and nothing good comes from hate and tyranny. So I think we have a little bit of a moral that we learn when we explore the character of Capulet. We also see that he's presented as the protective father, demonstrating when he guides Paris to let 2 more summers wither in their pride, stating that then Juliet will be ripe to be a bride. Shakespeare's use of natural imagery presents Juliet as a vulnerable child, not ready to face the world without the guidance of her father. In asking Paris to wait as she is, yet a stranger in the world, demonstrates that Capulet is fully aware that his daughter is still a child and should not be expected to know what she wants or make decisions. Controversially, this demonstrates Capulet as a progressive father, and the result could be quite shocking for the Elizabethan audience. At this time, it was the norm for parents to plan strategic pairings. The idea that Capulet is giving Juliet any kind of voice would have been challenging even to women of the time. He tells Paris to woo her. The connotations of the word woo are to be courted and impressed, thus showing that Capulet is a thoughtful and caring father. The audience wonders at this stage if when he tells Paris that too soon marred are those so early made, that he is speaking through personal experience. However, there is ambiguity, it's not clear. Should the audience see this as a criticism of his wife, claiming that she is now marred or somewhat ruined, and less appealing? Or could he be positioning the blame for the marring on his own shoulders, therefore telling Paris that men must have more respect for women, be patient and not rush the transition between childhood and adulthood? So you've got 2 model paragraphs there, and I just want you to take note of the fact that throughout those paragraphs, there is the use of quotations, there is the constant reference to Shakespeare and Shakespeare's intention and the methods Shakespeare is using, and also reference to the Elizabethan audience, how they would have responded. You might want to try your own piece of extended writing on Capulet, or you might want to make a character profile or a timeline of his actions and behaviour. So just to finish off, here is a little compilation of key quotations from Capulet, and they are in chronological order. Now again, you might want to take some time to pause this video and stop and copy them down to get a really good understanding of this character. Some of these quotations you would have already seen. So, the caring father at the start, my child is yet a stranger in the world. Let 2 more summers wither in their pride, and then she will be ripe to be a bride. Then what we see is his anger at Tybalt. So when Tybalt questions Capulet at the party, and Capulet is furious, and he says to Tybalt, go to, you are a saucy boy, is it so indeed? You are a princock's go, be quiet. For shame, I'll make you quiet. So he's putting Tybalt back in his place. He uses insults. He calls him a saucy boy, a princox. He's basically saying, you know, he actually says, am I the man here or you? So he's reminding Tybalt that he is in charge. And this is the start of Capulet's authority being challenged. When Juliet is crying over the death of Tybalt, but also the loss of Romeo, we see him acting quite sympathetically. And again, the language of nature is used. He talks about her crying, you know, tears evermore showering in one little body. He thinks her body is like a little boat lost at sea, and that she's tempest tossed. So it's like she's tossed in a storm, and he's really worried about her. And this is part of the reason he decides to bring the wedding forward. Now, just here, he says, how now, wife, have you delivered to her our decree? So he's saying, have you told her the good news about the wedding? Even the term wife, I guess, helps to show how Capulet is the patriarch. You know, these women are objectified almost by him. Now, when he's arranging the wedding, he speaks to Paris, and he says, Sir Paris, I will make a desperate tender of my child's love. I think she will be ruled in all respects by me. Now, there's some irony there, because she isn't ruled in all respects by him. What he doesn't know is that she's already secretly married to somebody else. So again, it's kind of showing his desire to show his authority. He's telling Paris she will be ruled by me. Now, when Juliet refuses to marry Paris, we see his aggressive nature here. He says, fettle your fine joints against Thursday next to go with Paris to St. Peter's Church, or I will drag thee on a hurdle hither. Out, you green sickness carrying, out, you baggage, you tallow face. Capulet has clearly changed. He's been challenged by Tybalt and Juliet, and now we're seeing him reinforcing his patriarchal dominance. He calls her baggage and a disobedient wretch. You know, it's very harsh and derogatory. Now, when he discovers Juliet is dead, we see him absolutely bereft and heartbroken. Death lies on her like an untimely frost upon the sweetest flower of all the field. Again, we see that return to natural imagery and his true feelings for Juliet arising again, that to him, she is this beautiful, delicate flower that he was trying to nurture and protect, and now he's lost her to this untimely frost. He says, death is my son-in-law, death is my heir, my daughter he hath wedded, I will die and leave him all, life living, all is death. So basically, since Juliet's death, he's a completely broken man. And then in Act 5, we see him bury the hatchet. He says, "O brother Montague, give me thy hand, poor sacrifices of our enmity." So he acknowledges that it's his poor behaviour and allowing this feud to fester like a cancer in the society that has led to the death of his most precious child, and he's learnt a lesson. So Act 5, we see this Pyrrhic victory. The sacrifice has been huge, but finally we have a glooming peace upon the city. So that is your lesson on Capulet. What I would really like you to do would be to take some time to watch back through this video, to make some notes and to write down some key quotes. I would ask you to try and write down at least one key quote per act or the acts that we've looked at, and to maybe write down some key words to describe Capulet and how he changes, and ultimately think about what is his role and function in the play. Why does Shakespeare include this character? What do we learn about society in this time? So what do we learn about patriarchy through Capulet? What do we learn about fatherhood and how he behaves towards his daughter? What do we learn about violence and feuding through the character of Capulet? So thanks for listening, and I will speak to you again soon.